Alright, so today we're actually not doing any painting, which is a bit strange for me, but I'm going to be talking about how to make a watercolour card. So, you may or may not know this already, but you really can't paint with watercolour straight onto a regular card. So this is just made from regular old paper, not watercolour paper. And what that means is that if you do start painting with watercolour on this card, you might have a little bit of success, but if you put on too much water and paint, the card will buckle and it won't sit flat. And you also may end up with the paper itself just literally falling apart, or the colours won't sit in a way that looks effective and that you are happy with. So I've got a few suggestions for you, and I must admit that I did start off painting on just regular old cards like this, but I learnt quite quickly that it was better to paint on watercolour paper and then get the image onto my card, or turn my watercolour paper literally into a card. So this is an A5 piece of watercolour paper, and if I was to fold it in half, it would be almost exactly the same size as this card. So that is one tip. Just straight away, you could just ignore the rest of what I say in this tutorial and simply get your watercolour card that is A5 and make sure that you fold it perfectly in the middle, and just like use a ruler or something like that to just make sure that the crease in the middle is perfectly crisp, and there you go, you've got a card that you can paint on straight away. You can even paint on the inside. But today what I'm going to show you is something a little bit different to that. So we're going to be using, as I mentioned, just a regular old card. This is just from a craft shop, pretty cheap, and it came in a pack with envelopes and everything too. I've got a sheet of watercolour paper. I've got a pencil, which I may or may not use. I've got a glue stick type thing. I couldn't actually find a normal glue stick, so I have a glue pen, which I'm not super sure about, so I would recommend a glue stick if you're following along at home. I've also got a ruler that I may or may not use. So my first suggestion is, if you're not going to turn your actual watercolour paper into a card itself, then you can grab your card that you are going to be using, and you can just trace around it with your pencil. And because they're basically the same width, I'm actually probably not going to trace anything other than like lining the bottom of it up on the paper and lining the sides up as best as I can. I'll probably I'm actually not going to do a line down this side, because honestly it's so close that I think just a little bit of a trim and it will be fine. But I'm going to draw a line across the top so I know how tall the card is, and I actually could fit a second one there. And as you can see, and as I mentioned before, one card folded in half, one sheet of paper folded in half will make a card. But you could paint two designs on this sheet of paper, which you've marked out so you know where to stop, and just make sure that you don't go too close to the edges, because when you trim it, you might trim off part of your image. But you can paint your image on this piece of paper that is marked out the correct size, and then once it's dry, use a pair of scissors or a guillotine if you've got one to trim along that line, and you can stick it on the card.